Welcome back, folks. This is a video lecture on simple chemistry. Where do we begin? Well, let's begin by showing you my PowerPoint slides. And I'm going to annotate them as I did last time. So I'm going to use my annotation skills, which are not that good, and we'll try to annotate this particular figure. So let's go to the agenda. And the agenda today is straightforward, but very important, right? If there's one thing that students may not realize, the importance of chemistry to this entire course. And you'll realize in a few moments why that's important. But the agenda is here. So we're going to look at basic atomic structure first. Then we'll look at the relationship between cells and chemistry. Very, very important. That sets the foundation for the entire semester. Atomic number versus atomic mass versus Avogadro's number. Important concepts that we all need to know. And then the most important thing today is chemical forces. And we'll learn the 5 types of chemical forces which are responsible for life itself. And then we'll quickly talk about some weird properties that water has. And those weird properties, unusual properties, make life possible as far as we know in this universe on this planet. So let's get started. About 20 minutes, I should say. So where do we start? We start with some basic atomic structure. Now, this figure that you see in the top corner of my slide, it's a very rudimentary figure. That means it's a very low-level figure, right? The actual arrangement of parts of an atom is much more complex than this. But if you want to learn that, you should take a physics class or something. But this is good enough for us. So all we need to know is that we have electrons whizzing around on the outside of an atom. And then we have in the middle of the atom, in most cases, we have 2 objects, right? We have protons and we have neutrons. So let's write that down. So in the center of the atoms, we have protons. And those protons, they have a positive charge. Just like a magnet with a positive terminal and a negative terminal, right? So the positive charge is very important. And then also inside the heart of a nucleus of an atom, we have a neutron. And the neutron has 0 charge, right? That means it has no charge whatsoever. Now I want to tell you something that's going to be important later on. The neutron is actually made up of 2 other subparticles. So the neutron is made up of something that has a positive charge, and the neutron is also made up of something that has a negative charge. So the positive charge and the negative charge inside the neutron, they cancel each other out. Okay? Therefore, there's no charge on the neutron. Now, what is this positive charge? Well, here's the amazing part. That positive charge is a hidden proton inside the neutron. And what is the negative charge? That's actually an electron hidden away inside the neutron. Blew my mind when I first heard this, right? And the consequences of that will become clear when we go deeper into that understanding. But for now, the center of an atom is made up of protons and neutrons. Now, there's one exception in the entire universe that we know of, right? And the one exception is hydrogen. Hydrogen does not have any neutrons under normal circumstances inside its nucleus. It just has normally a single proton. That's all it has. So the periodic table, let me slow down. The periodic table is an attempt by humans to classify the atoms of the universe as far as we know, right? Now, let me stop talking about atoms and call them by their proper names, right? Different atoms of different substances are called elements. And that's the word right here. So carbon is an element. Hydrogen is an element. Gold is an element, right? And you can find them all on the periodic table. So let me get my arrow. Here's hydrogen. There's carbon. There's nitrogen. There's oxygen. There's chlorine. There's sulfur. There's phosphorus. And then down here you have gold and silver, right? And then you have copper and zinc and magnesium and manganese. All of them are there. All the stuff that you see on the side of a multivitamin bottle, that are simple inorganic materials will be right here, okay? So the periodic table is an attempt by humans to categorize the different elements that exist in this universe. For instance, this column deals with elements that don't like to react with anything else. So they call them the inert gases, right? Helium, neon, argon. Then we have the very reactive molecules here that like to fight with everything else. So fluorine and chlorine and all those things, right? And then we have the less reactive components right in the center here, like boron and carbon, right? And then the columns correspond to the size of the atom. So as you go from one layer to the next, the number of electrons whizzing around the outside of the atom, they move further and further out, okay? So the atoms get larger as you go down the periodic table. But guess what? I assume that you know this from high school chemistry. So why am I wasting your time? Let me get on. Go back to your notes over there. So the next thing is we have electrons whizzing around on the outside of an atom, and they have a negative charge. So what does this mean? Well, imagine that you're so small that you can travel through this kind of space. And you're traveling through space and you're approaching an atom. And as you approach that atom, the first thing you encounter are the electrons of the atom. Once you get through the electrons, then deep inside, you'll find the nucleus, right? So the most important thing is the outer surface of an atom, in most cases, is a cloud of electrons. That's going to become very relevant in the next few slides. So elements are their proper names, and they are made up themselves of these components: protons, neutrons, and electrons. So the next slide simply says, what do we need to know in this class? The most important thing is that life, living things, have a different chemical composition than the world around them, the outside world, right? So here's a cell, and this cell has a membrane depicted in blue. The chemistry outside the cell over here could consist of almost anything, depending on where the cell is. If that was an amoeba, just living in a water pond, it will have different chemistry than if it was living in the ocean, right? So the environment can vary, but the inside of the cell will be very, very precise. So the membrane of the cell acts as a filter. Just like you have a filter at home that filters the air and stops the pollen and the bacteria from going through and only allows air to pass through, that's what the membrane of living cells do. All living cells that have a membrane, and all have, that membrane is a filter. So some chemistry, like food, is allowed in. Other chemistry is rejected as it tries to come in. So the inside of a cell has a unique set of filtered chemistry compared to the outside. Unfortunately, poisonous substances like arsenic, they can't be stopped, and they will enter quite easily and poison the inside of a cell. So we have to be conscious, but we're talking about normal cells living in a normal environment. In addition, the cell may produce substances inside, and some of those substances are waste. So that waste has to be eliminated, otherwise the cell will become toxic. But other substances need to be retained. So those substances will be prevented from leaving by the same membrane, which rejects their exit. So this is going on day and night inside every living cell on this planet, all right? I like to tell my students, the most important thing in this class is that we look at the shape and charge of substances. Once we start understanding that shape and charge are very important in cell biology, that helps us learn cell biology. The next most important thing is this, that cells are highly organized sacks of chemistry, very highly organized. And they take a lot of energy every day to maintain that order. Otherwise the order breaks down. And we'll see that in another video lecture. So if that's the case, what is life? Life is nothing more than highly organized chemistry. I'm sorry, folks, it's letting you down, right? So Maybe keep it to yourself and don't share it with your relatives because they may get upset. But that's what it is. We have to be logical. We have to be honest. Once you die, what happens? The organized chemistry very quickly, within milliseconds, begins to become disorganized. And once it becomes disorganized, a cell never has enough energy available to recover from that condition. So once you tip the balance for a few milliseconds, the cell is going to die. Therefore, you and I spend 2/3 of our calories every day maintaining the environment around our cells so that the cells are happy. Okay, so this is the way that life works on this planet. So the filter is very important, and the membrane of the cell, and that's called the plasma membrane, right? Remember that, right? Membrane, that's a B. I'm trying to write with my mouse. I should get a tablet soon. Not a tablet, one of those, what are the Wiacom pads or whatever they call them. All right, so the membrane of a cell acts as a filter that allows some chemistry in and rejects other chemistry, okay? So that's very important. And we'll learn a lot more about membrane in chapter 11 when we get there. So moving on, let's go back into understanding the final bit of simple chemistry. As you may know, there are two very important numbers that go with each element. So in this case, we have hydrogen, H. This comes from the periodic table. There's a number above the hydrogen, and there's a number below the hydrogen. So the number above the hydrogen is called its atomic number. Very important, more important than you think. The atomic number simply represents the number of protons that are found inside the nucleus of that atom. So in the case of hydrogen, you find 1. In the case of helium, you find 2. In the case of oxygen, you find 6, okay? The atomic mass, the weight of the atom on this planet, the atomic mass is the number of protons, because they carry a mass of 1 unit. They have a mass of 1 unit, plus the number of neutrons. They also have a mass of 1 unit. So you have 1 proton and 1 neutron, then you have an atomic mass of 2. Now, hydrogen is an exception. It's the only odd one in the periodic table. It doesn't have any neutrons. It just has protons. So the mass of hydrogen is 1. The atomic number of hydrogen is 1. So is its mass, right? Now you can say, well, hang on a second, Dr. Delay, what the hell is that 0.008 on the end? Well, in a giant pool of hydrogen, there's always going to be some anomalies, right? Some odd hydrogens. And some hydrogens, believe it or not, can have a temporary neutron. A neutron comes in temporarily and before it's ejected, right? Don't worry about it. But the pattern is still there, right? Atomic number at the top is the number of protons. The atomic mass, or atomic weight, as some books call it, below is the number of protons plus neutrons. But what about the electrons? Well, the electrons weigh 1/2000th of the mass of either one of these, so we don't really count them, right? We don't really count them. So poor electrons. All right, so that's going to be important. So why am I telling you this? Why am I taking so much of your time talking about atomic number? Because if you change the atomic number, you change the identity of the element. Let's show you that. So suppose you have 6. I made a mistake earlier. I said oxygen has 6. Oxygen has 8. I'm sorry. I was thinking ahead. In this case, carbon has 6 protons inside its nucleus. Okay. Now, if you change that to 7, it's no longer carbon because you move across from 6 to 7 in the periodic table. So the identity of that element changes. It's no longer carbon, becomes nitrogen. Now, if you add another proton, then you get 8. Now you're oxygen. If you add another one, then you're fluorine. So the atomic number is very important. It will change the identity of the element. And if you remove, say, from oxygen 2 protons, then it becomes carbon. That's going to be important in atomic decay, right? atomic decays radioactivity as we know it. And there's a form of radioactivity that causes the number of protons to shift. And if the number of protons shifts, then the material that you have becomes something else. Very quickly, it's like uranium turning into lead after billions of years, right? And that's what happens. So that's what we have over here. Moving forward, Avogadro's number. What is that? Let me explain it. If you have a glass of water and you put into that glass exactly 18 grams of water, you weigh it up on a scale, you put 18 grams of water into that glass, then if you were to count the number of molecules of water, yeah, H2O, if you were to count them all, you would end up with Avogadro's number, which would be this. And this number has 23 zeros on the end, 6.02, and multiply that by 23 zeros. Now, that's more than a billion. Quadrillion? Oh my God, it's a huge number. So this just tells you the size of atoms, right? Atoms are extremely, extremely small compared to you and I. So 18 grams of water, which will be, you know, about 3 or 4 sips, 3 or 4 gulps, that's not much. So that's how we relate to Avogadro's number, right? If you take the mass of anything, carbon has a mass of 12. Yeah? How do we know that? Because it has 12 protons. Sorry, again, I'm sorry. It has 6 protons and it has 6 neutrons. And that adds up to 12, right? So that would be its mass. So carbon has a mass of 12. So if you put 12 grams of carbon dust into that glass, then you would have 6 times 10 to the 23 atoms of carbon, okay? So this applies both to atoms and to molecules. And we'll come back to the difference in a second. All right, and the same thing with the other stuff. In your book, it talks about sugar, glucose. Glucose has a mass of 180 grams, because you add up all the masses of all the atoms that make up a molecule of glucose. That's what it adds up to. And then what else do we have? I think the book mentions sodium chloride, and sodium chloride is made up of a sodium atom and a chlorine. And the mass of those two is 58. So you take 58 grams of salt from your salt shaker, then you have Avogadro's number of molecules of salt, right? That's how it works. All right. So let's talk about the most important thing today. The 5 types of chemical forces that hold chemistry together, right? If chemistry wasn't held together, you and I would just be a soup of individual elements, atoms with no structure. So DNA couldn't exist, right? The cell couldn't exist. Nothing could exist. In fact, the whole universe would be nothing. So what do we want you to learn? We want you to learn that there are 5 major forces responsible for life. And we're going to have to remember when to apply which one. What is a force? Force is invested energy. So when you make something, you can get energy released. When you break something, you may have to put energy in to separate. The best example I can think of explaining energy and force of this type is if you put 2 magnets together, they snap together. And they'll stay together indefinitely. In order for you to separate the magnets, you have to take your muscles, use energy inside your muscles from food that you ate early in the morning to pull the magnets apart, right? So you're trying to overcome that force. So in chemical bonding, chemical interactions, these forces are involved, right? When things come together, a force is invested. It's not just like 2 magnets coming together, right? If you want to separate things in chemistry, you have to pull them apart. Therefore, you have to add the force plus some extra to separate the original objects. So remember the 2 magnets. That's a great way to understand what happens when you make more complicated chemistry and then you break that complicated chemistry back to simple chemistry. We're going to be doing a lot of that in the next few lectures. So let's talk about covalent bonds, right? In a nutshell, covalent bonds entail two atoms, at least two atoms, coming close enough together to share their electrons. So remember the electrons on the outer surface, and if they're sharing their electrons, then they overcome any desire to become reactive. Let me put that in a graphical form. So let's stick with carbon, right? Because carbon is our favorite. So let's say carbon has a nucleus, and we won't go inside the nucleus, right? We don't care how many protons or neutrons there are. Then whizzing around on the outside, we have a single layer of electrons here that can only occupy two. So there's two electrons that fill the first shell. But we told you earlier that carbon has 6 electrons. Where are the other 4? The other 4 are further out. So this is the planet, and these are satellites. The next layer of satellites is out here. And you have here 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Whizzing around in the next layer. Here we go. So that gives us our 6 electrons. Now the outer layer wants to have 8. It wants to have 8 to become stable. So 4 satellites is not enough, 4 electrons. It needs 8 to become stable. Just take my word for that, right? It needs 8. So carbon is going to be looking around, looking for partnerships with other atoms, so it can become stable, right? And suppose over here somewhere we have an oxygen. Okay, so an oxygen atom. And the oxygen atom also has 2 electrons in its inner shell, but now it has 6 electrons in its outer shell, right? Let's put them down. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And it also wants to have 8 to become stable. So oxygen is also on the hunt, looking for a partnership. And if the 2 atoms are brought together, or they come together accidentally, then there's a chance, if they come at the right speed and everything else, there's a chance that they will interact with each other in a chemical reaction. And the oxygen will now form a relationship with the carbon. So what will happen is that the oxygen will say to the carbon, hey, carbon, you need 4 electrons to become stable. I need 2. Why don't we share some electrons? So at least you're sort of stable, right? And the carbon will say, okay, I agree to that. So what will happen is that the 2 electrons from the oxygen will be shared in such a place that they can pretend to belong to both. So these 2 electrons here, this one here, let me delete that, erase it. So let's put these electrons closer, and then we'll move these to the side. So what happens is the 2 atoms get closer together, and what they'll do, let's use a different color. 2 electrons from oxygen, let's put them in blue, and 2 electrons from carbon will now be in a position to be shared like this, right? So this shell will become so close that it'll do that. So now oxygen has a total of 8. It has 6 of its own outer, sorry, it has 6 of its own outer electrons, plus it borrows 2 from carbon. So now it's happy. But the carbon has now got 6. It had its 4 original ones, then it shares 2 with oxygen. So the carbon is now more stable than it was before, but it's still looking for another partnership. So maybe another oxygen atom will come by on the other side, and that will also share its electrons with carbon. So now you have something called carbon dioxide, where you have 1, 2 sharings going on there, and you have 2 sharings going on here. And that's what you see right here, right? Each of those lines, solid lines between the elements, carbon and oxygen in this case, indicates to me a covalent bond, a sharing of electrons. Oxygen can also form a relationship with another oxygen. So now the 6 electrons on the outside of the outer shell of oxygen from one atom and another oxygen atom, they share 2 electrons, and now they pretend that they are happy. They have 8 each, right? So covalent bonds are sharing of electrons. In order to share electrons, you have to come pretty close to your partner. And just like two magnets, right? When you have a negative charge on the outside, the electrons, you have a negative charge on the outside of this atom. When you bring them together, there's a resistance. The negative charges repel. So the atoms want to push away. So you have to put energy into pushing those atoms together. So when you make a covalent bond, you have to overcome the resistance. And once the resistance is overcome, then the atoms snap together and they start sharing their electrons in the outer shell. So you put energy into the system and you're stored energy between the two atoms. So that's how energy is stored inside molecules, right? A molecule is more than one atom bonded together. In this case, it's going to be 3 atoms, carbon dioxide. Therefore, when you break the bond sometime in the future, most of the energy will be released back into the environment. And that's what happens with food. So plants, they take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they take water from the soil, and they force the atoms to be rearranged into sugar. Now the sugar is a very powerful energy unit. And that sugar, when you eat it, in your body is dismantled. The sugar molecule is dismantled. And every time you break these covalent bonds, energy is released. And that energy is then used to run the cell, right? So you're now beginning to see how chemistry is very important to life. But more importantly, physics is what's going on here. So the laws of physics control the laws of chemistry, and then the laws of chemistry dictate the laws of biology. Very important stuff, right? So covalent bonds, they share electrons. Now, just to confuse your life a bit further, there's 2 types of covalent bonds. Yes, those that are non-polar, that means their surface has no charge difference from one end of the molecule to the other. So let's put that together. So here's a carbon, and here's another carbon, and their shared electrons will be halfway between the 2, right? So the distance from that nucleus to where the electrons are shared, and the distance from that nucleus to where the electrons are shared is exactly halfway, because each carbon is pulling and sharing electrons at the same distance from its nucleus. So if you look at the whole molecule, there is no uneven distribution of electrons. They're in the middle and they're supposed to be where they are. So how can we explain this? It's like a tug of war, right? The team on the left and the team on the right, they're pulling with equal force, and the rope stays right in the middle. It doesn't move to the left or the right. So the flag on the rope doesn't move. The other type of covalent bond is called a polar covalent bond. So let's draw that. Let's put carbon here, and let's put oxygen over here. So in this case, the electrons that you're sharing between the two when they form a covalent bond, right? And remember, a covalent bond is a sharing of 2 electrons, one from one atom, one from the other atom, right? So we have a covalent bond here, and the distance of the electrons in this share is not even. The electrons are spending most of their time around the oxygen, and the oxygen has a more powerful grip on those electrons. Therefore, in this case, in the tug of war, the rope is moving towards oxygen, right? Because it's more powerful. Now, because the electrons are more on this side of the molecule, therefore this side of the molecule has a slight, we use that delta symbol, a small d, with a negative charge. So that side of the molecule is negatively charged. Because the electrons are disappeared, there's now more positive charge in the center of that atom, the nucleus. So therefore, this side of the molecule has a slightly positive charge. So we're now polarized, right? If you have a polarizing conversation, you're trying to split the audience, right? So that same word polar is used here. So this is a polar covalent bond. So there's 2 types of covalent bonds: non-polar, everything's evenly distributed, and polar, which is a lopsided. How do we know what kind of a relationship 2 atoms will have? Well, we can use our knowledge from chemistry to investigate the relative pulling power of different atoms. And those values have been calculated. Don't worry about how they're calculated, but they're listed here in this special periodic table. So you can see hydrogen has a pulling power of 2.2. Right? You can see the number right there. And let's say we're going to combine that with carbon, right? Carbon and hydrogen bonds are very common in living things. So carbon has a pulling power of 2.55. So even though carbon will pull electrons slightly this way, and they won't be dead in the middle, they'll be slightly over here, it's near enough. So carbon and hydrogen will form a non-polar covalent bond, right? Non-polar, because it's evenly distributed. But let's go with carbon and oxygen. So let's take a carbon now and bond it to an oxygen, right? So carbon is 2.55. And oxygen is 3.04. So oxygen has more pulling power. So instead of finding the electrons halfway, you will find the electrons over here. So that's completely different to finding the electrons over here, right? So this side of the molecule will be slightly negative. That side of the molecule will be slightly positive, where here, there will be no difference. So this will be a non-polar covalent bond, and this will be a polar. Right? So polarity is very important, as we'll find out soon. So let's move on quickly to ionic bonds. Ionic bonds are where atoms, instead of sharing electrons, they give them away or they accept them, right? So they either donate the electrons or they accept the electrons. And that makes it easier for them to exist. So here's sodium, this typical example. Salt is the typical example that we use, right? Sodium chloride, table salt. So sodium has an extra electron by itself whizzing around way, way outside its atom, right? Right there, by itself, one electron. And it wants to become stable. Instead of gaining 7 electrons, which is hard, it just gives that one away and says, take my electron and the next shell below will be happy, right? So the next shell below has 8 electrons. That's going to be happy. And chlorine over here, chlorine has 7 electrons in its outer shell. And you know where I'm going now, right? For it to become happy, it needs to have 8, right? So that's 6, that's 7. And chlorine has in its outer shell 7 electrons. And chlorine is looking for an extra electron to fill that vacancy, so it becomes happy. So what happens is when the sodium and chloride are within a reasonable distance of each other, the sodium throws its electrons over and donates it to chlorine. That's it. Now, each electron carries a negative charge, right? So as soon as you do that, then this atom has more positive charge in the nucleus than it has negative charge in its orbitals. So it gains a positive charge, a huge positive charge, a full positive charge. And when this one accepts an electron, it gains a full negative charge and it becomes negatively charged, right? So as you know, a positive charge and a negative charge, if they're within a reasonable distance of each other, will attract. And that's exactly what happens. This chlorine and this sodium, they fall in love and they get attracted and they form a relationship, right? And then once that relationship is formed, it's going to take energy to break it up, okay? And you can see that going on here, right? So here's the electron being donated, and there's your attraction between the charges, and then the 2 atoms are pulled together by the charges so that they have some type of union. Let me tell you something quickly. The distance that these 2 atoms are closing in on each other when they're in love is not as close as in the previous example where electrons are being shared. So when you share electrons, you're forced even closer than ionic bonds. So what does that tell me? That tells me that covalent bonds are stronger than ionic bonds because the atoms are closer and it takes more energy to rip them apart, right? So ionic bonds are very important and they can only form with elements that are on the extreme ends of the periodic table, right? So if you take something from this side of the periodic table, that likes to give away electrons to become stable. If you take something over here, that likes to accept electrons, right? So the most common elements are formed by this column, ionic elements, and by this column. whereas covalent bonds are in the middle, where sharing takes place. So again, there's another pattern there, right? So you may know that from high school. All right. So what do we have next? Let's move on to hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds confuse students. So this is another type of force. And one of the participants must be hydrogen. Otherwise, they wouldn't be called a hydrogen bond. So one of the two atoms that are participating in this relationship must be hydrogen. And the other atom must want to steal electrons. So it has to come from the part of the periodic table that has a lot of electronegative values, right? So let's go back to this figure here. So anything in red is going to be very powerful at grabbing electrons, right? And anything in yellow, it gives away electrons very easily, right? It says, I take my electron, I want to become stable. So when hydrogen, which is orange, comes together with these red elements, then you have the potential to form a hydrogen bond. Okay, and the two most common elements that we find inside living cells, because they filter chemistry, are oxygen, nitrogen, and chlorine, right? So that's what I have on this slide. So the most common types of hydrogen bonds are between oxygen and hydrogen, or between nitrogen and hydrogen, or between chlorine and hydrogen. So what is a hydrogen bond? It's simply a magnetic attraction. Nothing to do with sharing electrons or donating electrons. It's simply, you know, you have somebody walking past and they catch your eye, right? You have an attraction, but a flirting attraction. Once that person walks away, you normally keep on walking, right? So that's what hydrogen bonds can be considered as, a flirting attraction between atoms. One of them must be hydrogen. So let me explain that in the example that's given here, right? So we have an oxygen atom, and that's bonded to a hydrogen, okay? And that has an electron going around the outside. So as you know, oxygen likes to grab electrons. So when these two atoms share electrons to form a covalent bond, the atoms, so the electrons are spending most of their time over here in this relationship between oxygen and hydrogen. Remember, this is a covalent bond, right? This is a sharing of electrons. We haven't spoken about hydrogen bonds yet. So the electrons are mostly over here. So this side of the molecule has a slightly negative charge, and this side of the molecule has a slightly positive charge. So now you can see it's a polarized covalent bond. Now, this positive charge, it emanates in all directions, right? The positive charge goes into space like a sphere. So the charge is like an aura going in all directions, like the sun giving off light in all directions. So if you have another oxygen over here that's passing by, and it's bonded to a hydrogen of its own, and this side is slightly negative, and this molecule is passing by, right? There will be a small attraction between the positive charge of the hydrogen and the negative charge of the oxygen, as long as the distance is appropriate. And as that molecule gets closer and closer, then that force builds up. And that force is indicated like this, as by a dotted line or by a striped line, to indicate that it's a flirting temporary force. And that is a hydrogen bond right there, right? This is a covalent bond. This is a hydrogen bond. And as the energy of that molecule carries it further away like this up here, then that hydrogen bond will break because it's too far away now to have an influence across that much space. So in this case, hydrogen bonds are temporary, but they can form very quickly and they can dissipate very quickly. So that's what a hydrogen bond is. And this molecule here may be deviated ever so slightly because of this hydrogen bond, because of the attraction. We'll talk more about hydrogen bonds in a worksheet. Let's move on to van der Waals forces, my favorite. So what are the van der Waals forces? Well, let me tell you the example of this. I was going to say Geico. It's a gecko, right? Geico is a company. So this gecko, which you find around your homes, is able to walk on walls and up onto ceilings. It doesn't have any glue on its feet. It doesn't have any suckers like some frogs. It doesn't have any hooks like cockroaches. So how does it manage? And the answer is simple. It uses chemistry. Yes, in fact, scientists, and there's a 60 minutes episode that talks about Spider-Man and gecko skin. You can take this gecko, turn it upside down, stick it on the ceiling, and hang on its back 50 pounds. In fact, more than 50 pounds, about 50 pounds for an average adult gecko. And the gecko will not fall off the ceiling. That's how powerful its grip is to the ceiling. That's amazing. So how does the van der Waals forces work? Well, as it tells you here, these are oscillations. So if you have a carbon atom here that's part of the ceiling, it's got electrons going around it, right? And sometimes electrons on this side, and a fraction of a second later, the electrons over there. And then you have, say, let's put another carbon here. That belongs to the skin of the gecko, right? And it also has electrons that are whizzing around like that. If the two electrons, the one from the ceiling and the one from the foot of the gecko, can be made to oscillate in synchrony, then at one point in time, let's put that down, this is very important. At one point in time, once you get synchronization, at one point in time, you will have the electrons of this ceiling atom facing this way, and the electron of the gecko's foot of that atom facing that way. So this electron will be attracted to the nucleus of this. So there's an attraction there, right? So that attraction will pull the gecko onto the ceiling. But a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a second later, you will find that the electrons have moved. Now the electrons are over here, right? And once they're over there, this attraction disappears. So this is a temporary oscillation attraction. But again, when the electrons move once more, let's get rid of it. When the electrons move once more to their new positions, because they're in synchronization, when that one's facing that way, this electron from this carbon is facing that way. Now there's an attraction this way. And when the electrons go to 6 o'clock on both atoms, then the attraction goes away. So you would expect that the gecko would fall off when the electrons are in a different position. Well, that's not true, because there's gazillions and gazillions, I can't even think of the number, right? Quadrillions and quadrillions and quadrillions of atoms that are matching up the contours of the skin of the gecko with the contours of the ceiling, so that the skin of the gecko is like a mountain range that fits into the mountain range that forms the surface of the skin. And at every point along where the two mountain ranges contact, van der Waals forces are going around. So for the atom above, it may be in this configuration. The atom below, or the atoms below, they may have their electrons over here, right? And the atoms below, they may have their electrons over here. So at this snapshot, this is being attracted. There's no attraction there. This is being attracted. So at least some of the atoms at any one point in time, out of the gazillions, are attracting, whereas the others are resetting by spinning around. But there's enough there to keep the gecko attached to the ceiling. You might be saying, how does the gecko then take the next step? Well, the gecko is very clever. It peels off its toes, the heel first, so that there's enough force there to break these van der Waals forces. So it slides, it sort of rolls its foot off, right? Then it takes the next step by slapping it down. It's amazing. So van der Waals forces by themselves are temporary and tiny, but when you multiply them by the number of contact points between two surfaces, you have a significant force. We'll try to take that concept up in a worksheet. And the final one is hydrophobic interactions. The cytoplasm of your cell, or the nuclear plasm of your cell, the inside of your cell, is mostly made of water type material, right? Like a gel. And the outside world, in most cases, is also water, right? Water-based. So water is everywhere, except that the membrane of the cell, it is made of fat, lipids, so it doesn't like water. But let's concentrate on the inside of a cell, right? So this is the inside of a cell. Here we go. This is a cell. And you take this molecule and you dump it into the cell. Now, along the surface of the molecule, you have areas that mix with water because they're made of polar covalent interactions. And you have other regions, like in red, that are made of non-polar atomic interactions. So these red areas, they don't like charge. The blue areas, they love charge. So this molecule here will automatically, by itself, without even thinking, take up a new shape inside the cell, where the surface that's exposed to the water molecules, which are here, right, will be the regions of the molecule that love water. So the water side of the molecule will face outwards, and the water-hating part of the molecule, or the water-faring part of the molecule, will be forced to take up a crowded interior. That is a hydrophobic interaction, right? Because of the presence of water in the environment, this molecule is forced to take up a new shape. And when you force something to take up a shape and keep that shape, you're investing energy. There's a force involved, right? That's what we call a hydrophobic interaction. Very common inside cells, right? Because like I said, most of the environment inside the cell is polar. So polar things like to mix with polar, and non-polar doesn't like to mix with polar, right? Oil and water, polar and non-polar. So that property that we see all the time when we see an oil spill in the kitchen is a fundamental property that then transitions into life. And that's a very important property, this one here, right? And I can't tell you enough about it during the rest of the semester. So let's go to the last slide. And it says water has some weird properties. Yes, water is an unusual substance. When you freeze water, instead of the molecules getting closer together, like in all other substances, they actually get further apart. So ice has a higher, wrong word, ice has a lower density than water, liquid water. Therefore, ice will float on the surface of liquid water. But if you do the same thing with like liquid nitrogen, when you freeze liquid nitrogen, it becomes a liquid, right? But when you freeze it further, it becomes a solid. And that solid sinks to the bottom of the container. So if that happens to the oceans of the world will be frozen from the bottom up, and only the top, maybe 10 or 12 feet will be water. Therefore, thank God, water has this unusual property, because in the winter, it doesn't kill all the fish in the pond or the ocean. Only the surface is ever frozen, right? If it gets that cold. Amazing. The second thing is the boiling point and melting point of water are unusual. They're unusual. If we had another substance and we heated it up to the same degree as water, like during the day with sunlight, that substance in the oceans will evaporate into space. Whereas water doesn't do that much, right? Most of the water stays in the ocean. Why? Because of hydrogen bonds. Water forms lots of hydrogen bonds amongst itself. And those hydrogen bonds prevent the partner molecules from leaving until you add a lot of heat. That's why it takes so much energy on the cooker to boil some water. If it was alcohol, it'd be evaporated very quickly, right? So because of hydrogen bonding between water molecules, it has these weird properties. And the shape of the molecule, it's shaped like a boomerang, right? Water molecules shaped like a boomerang with the oxygen here. And instead of the hydrogens being on either side, the hydrogens are actually down here at an angle like this, right? And you're seeing water molecules represented like that. But why? Well, remember, oxygen will share its electrons to form a covalent bond. So one of these red ones belongs to oxygen, the other one belongs to hydrogen, right? And hydrogen only has one electron. So this is a covalent bond between oxygen and hydrogen, right? In fact, the electron should be more closer to the body of the oxygen, as we discussed earlier. Regardless, I told you that oxygen has 6 electrons in its outer shell that belong to it. So the other electrons are here, the other 4 that belong to oxygen. And they then form a space right here, and they force this hydrogen down. And these two occupy this space and they force this hydrogen down. So that causes a molecule to bend like a boomerang. So a water molecule looks like a boomerang. And because it looks like a boomerang, it can then have polar properties, right? This side of the molecule up here is slightly negative charged. This side of the molecule down here is slightly positively charged. And that allows this molecule then to form hydrogen bonds with another boomerang that's over here that's passing by with a slightly positive charge. And another boomerang over here that interacts with these electrons with a slightly positive charge. Then another oxygen over here that belongs to this water molecule that forms a hydrogen bond there. So hydrogen bond there, hydrogen bond here, hydrogen bond here, of course. And then another boomerang going across here that will have his oxygen here that forms a hydrogen bond. So a single water molecule can form 4 hydrogen bonds with its surrounding partners. Yes, in ice, these are static, but in liquid water, they're moving around, right? So it's this that stops oceans from evaporating in sunlight and your body from overheating as soon as you move your arms and legs and do some exercise, right? Finally, water is a very good solvent for other polar substances. So if you have sodium chloride, which is ionic, it has a positive and a negative charge. It loves to mix with water because water says, yeah, I love anything that has an uneven distribution of charge. But if you take some methane, which has no polar bonds, it won't mix with water, right? So this is how the world of chemistry is divided. Those things that can mix with water and those things that can't. A solution is nothing more than a solvent, water, plus something dissolved in it, like sodium chloride. So that's how you get salt water, right? The solvent doesn't have to be water, but in most living things it is. So water is a universal component of living things on this planet. It may be on other planets that may have life, who knows? Because things can dissolve in water, water can also control something called pH. That's the number of free hydrogens running around without any partnership. So the more hydrogen you have running around without anybody owning them, the more dangerous they are because they cause havoc, like naughty kids running around right in a park. So the higher the number of hydrogens that are alone, the lower the pH, the more acidic it is, right? And as you remove those hydrogens by picking them up, then the pH begins to increase towards neutral, pH 7. So that's how pH works. So your bodies have to maintain their pH, because if you change the pH, you change the environment, then it causes the molecules that exist in that environment to adopt a new shape. So if you take a protein that works at pH 7 and you throw it into your stomach, which is a pH 2, that protein is going to change its shape and become different. It may not work anymore, right? Or it will take up a new shape. So that's how important pH is. And you spend a lot of your calories every day maintaining your body temperature, your salt concentration, and your pH. So this chapter, the beginning of the chapter, is a pretty tough chapter to get used to. So I've taken longer than my 20 minutes, maybe 50 minutes, but I think it's worth it. So if you have the time, go ahead and do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a survey of the class over the weekend and see what you like me to speed up. So these videos can be 20 minutes at max, right? That's what's recommended, between 15 and 20 minutes. Otherwise, students just tune out. But the good thing is you can rewind or fast forward to the point that makes sense to you. Thank you so much.